Hello and welcome to my channel. I am Jason White and this is Jason's Weird Reads, and today I'm going to be discussing some more recent reads. So far I've been up to a pretty good year, a reading year, except I have yet to find that elusive 5-star read. I've seen other people earlier in the year complaining, or at least mentioning, that they were having trouble finding a 5-star read. I've had the same issue. Having said that, though, I think it's possible that I found myself a new favorite fantasy author. And I'm going to get into that author right away in my recent reads, and that is Michael J. Sullivan. Now, he is the author of the Rhyria Chronicles and the Rhyria Revelations. I tried reading the Rhyria Revelations around 2017, I think it was, and I just couldn't get into it. I don't know why. And then it was either late last year or early this year, I saw Petra, I think Petra Leo, talking about how he had a similar issue, that he had trouble getting into the books, the Rhyria Revelation books. And so he said he went back to the Rhyria Chronicles, which were written after, but they are prequels. So it's a full series of 4 books that takes place before the Rhyria Revelations. And so the Rhyria chronicles how Hadrian and Royce form what is to become known as the Rhyria. And I can't remember exactly what Rhyria means, but it's basically them together as a working group who, or a working pair who they basically, you can go hire them to do certain deeds for you if you have the gold, so to speak. So I read the entire Rhyria Chronicles, which is 4 books, and it starts off with the Crown Tower. Now, this book is where they meet, and let me tell you, this book is a hoot. And one reason why Petrick said that it's really good to go back to these books, or I keep saying going back, but maybe, it's not necessarily, but maybe read these books first, is because you get to see how these two meet, and it's quite funny how they meet. A lot of people, you'll see when they're talking about anything Rhyria, how the two main characters, their banter together, and I didn't really see it in the Rhyria Revelations books that I read, but I did see it a lot here. And Petrick mentioned in his review, or when he was talking about these books in his video, how he felt similar in that he wanted to see that banter between the two main characters that everyone was talking about. It seemed absent in the Rhyria Revelations, but it's definitely in this first book, The Crown Tower. Because when Rory and Hadrian meet, they hate each other. It's almost like it's a bromance. This whole series is like a long bromance, but it's like a hate to love bromance. So it's a very interesting way, I think, maybe of putting it. But that makes it a lot of fun, especially when you're going through how when they first meet they don't like each other. And there's a lot more comedy I found in The Crown Tower than any of the other books. There's a scene where Hadrian's on a ship floating down the river. There's this mysterious character on the boat with everyone else, and everyone's like, oh, that guy, he must be a murderer. He's got shifty eyes. He must be a killer. I am totally not doing any good service to how funny that situation was, but it was just, it had me laughing out loud, and I truly appreciated for that. And the next book is The Rose and the Thorn. That's all I'm going to say, actually, about the plot of these books, because I actually went into these books absolutely blind. The only thing I knew was what I've said, and that Rory and Hadrian meet and sort of form their team, their connection to each other, in what will become very important in later books, I'm assuming. Becomes important in this series. So up next is The Rose and the Thorn, which was a lot of fun. I think The Crown Tower was the best of these, which was the first book. So The Rose and the Thorn was a lot of fun as well. The Death of Dulgath comes third, and The Disappearance of Winter's Daughter is the fourth book. And as I said, they were all fun, but the first one, The Crown Tower, was just a hoot. I think if you're just looking for some fun, definitely and you want to read a fantasy book, definitely check out the Raya Chronicles. It's just that it's fun. There is some darkness in this. Like, people say how light fantasy this is, and like the tone of how dark it can get. But I found there's some darkness in this. Like, some bad things happen to good people. It's not just like slice of life type thing. There is struggle, and there's blood, and there's murder. But it's all sort of taken in a lighthearted way. So I guess it's all what you bring to it. I absolutely enjoyed it though, and I'm going to go back into the Raya Revelations at some point. And so yeah, there you go. I read the Raya Chronicles by Michael J. Sullivan, and depending on how the Raya Revelations go, I may just have found myself a new favorite fantasy author. He's really fun to read, and that goes a long way in my books. All right, I also am finishing up the Rift War Saga by Raymond E. Feist. I've mentioned this before. I read this. It's technically a trilogy, but they made it when it went into paperback form. The hardcover of Magician Apprentice and Magician Master was supposed to be just one book, but that's what it came out as when it was in hardcover, when it was originally published way back in like 1982. And then when they published it in paperback form, the mass market paperback form, they decided to split the Magician book into two. And so you have Magician Apprentice and Magician Master. And you know, it's not a terrible idea, honestly, because those two books are so very different from each other while continuing the same story. I think I have a lot to say about this book because reading the first two books, Magician Apprentice and Magician Master, completely took me back to my childhood when I was reading these books and fell in love with them. The nostalgia was just incredible. I had so much fun reading about Pug and Thomas and Arutha. Being back in Cryde, it was just it was something that I needed. I was so glad to go back and revisit it. But the rest of the series, which is Silverthorn and A Darkness at Sethon, those books are very different. It's almost a different series. You could argue that Magician Apprentice and Magician Master are a duology of books, while Silverthorn and A Darkness at Sethon are another duology, because the main plot line within the Magician books, the main plot line is it's pretty well solved by the end of those two books. You could tell that this was a series that Raymond E. Feist probably started out as a single book, and he sold it, and it sold a lot of copies, and they wanted more, and so they decided to make more, and they decided to clump the two different storylines into one series, which I think maybe is a mistake. I don't know. But let me tell you, the Magician books are so much more fun. There's a lot to find in Silverthorn and A Darkness at Sethon as well, but they're not nearly as fun, in my opinion, as the Magician books. And going back to when I was younger, a lot younger, and reading those books, I think I remember I felt somewhat the same. I was able to pull out a lot more things that I didn't notice the first time, and remind myself of a lot of different things. But to be honest with you, I even then I don't think I liked Silverthorn a lot, but I'm really I'm finishing up A Darkness at Sethon right now as we speak, and I am struggling through it. It just feels like it was just put together for the sake of finishing up the storyline itself. That's just the way it feels to me. Silverthorn, it holds nothing to what Silverthorn was, or the Magician books for that matter. there's a lot of people who say that this is a callback, that this series is classic fantasy, and it definitely is because of the time period it was published, and because there's elves and dwarves and goblins and all that kind of stuff within this book. But I think it's a mistake to just categorize Raymond E. Feist's series into being classic fantasy and that's it, because there's so much more. There's way more. Like, the magic system itself is very, I wouldn't say complex, but there's a lot to it, and it literally takes you to other worlds. And the fascinating thing about this series is that you actually go to different planets. It's almost science fiction in that way. There's a very soft, very, very soft science fiction element to this within the magic system. And so that makes it original, maybe even in today's standards. I don't know. So that was my thoughts on the Riftware Saga by Raymond E. Feist. I was really glad to go back to it, but at the same time, I'll be so glad when I'm done, because Darkness at Sethon is dragging like hell to me. I just want it to end so I can move on to other things. I also read a couple of space horror books, and one of them was released just this year. I believe it was released in either late February or early March. I can't remember. I know I read it around mid-March, somewhere in there. It might even been released in January. I can't remember. My memory is just horrible. Anyway, so that's, of course, I'm talking about Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes. This book was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed my time in the book, but the book definitely has some pacing issues. Some really weird choices were made in the writing of this book. Ultimately, I want to say up front that I really enjoyed this book. There's some really interesting things that were going on within this book, and I really enjoyed the mental health representation, and there were some other things. I think there was even a gay couple. I can't remember exactly. The one thing that bothered me the most, though, was the way the story is structured. You have like two halves of the story. You have what happened in the past, because when you start the story, it's the captain of the ship telling her story to the authorities, basically, as to what happened on the spaceship that she was on, why everyone is dead and she's the only one left alive. And so she's telling her story. Each chapter starts off with her talking to her interviewers, and then she goes back into her story. About halfway through the book, it switches without finishing that first story. So in the second part of the story, it's a bit of a spoiler here, but in that second part of the story, they say, okay, we're going back to that ship now. And so the ending of the first story is forgotten, just completely abandoned. And we go back. We just head back to this haunted ship that was missing for years and decades, actually. And there's obviously something wrong with that ship. It's all explained in the end, and it makes perfect sense. And, you know, the good thing about this book is it's very, very gory. I mean, this book is nasty. I was surprised at how gory it was. But going back to the issue, it was a very strange and jarring decision that somebody made somewhere along the lines and decided to just let it go through anyway. I think they should have just finished off that first story instead of finishing it off while we're going through, because they didn't even really finish it off all that much then. There's a huge gap in memory that's just missing, and it feels like it's missing for reasons of convenience rather than to aid the story. So that was a big problem within Dead Silence. Other than that, if you can get past that, this book is a lot of fun, and I still highly recommend it, just for some of the weird situations you get into. I mean, this book has some real creepy aspects. I do believe it was a horror book. There's some question as to whether or not it was a horror book or a thriller, a space thriller, I guess, but no, I think this is psychological horror with possible supernatural elements. You'll just have to read and find out for yourself. So that was an interesting read. I really enjoyed it. And I also read in the space horror here, Ship of Fools by Richard Paul Russo. I saw Rachel from Shades of Orange talk about this book a couple of times, and she said it was pretty good, and I have to agree. This book was really good. I did have some issues with this book as well. Just some it felt like and there's nothing wrong with this, but I'm pretty sure the author wrote this book by the seat of their pants, meaning that they didn't know how it was going to end when they started it, because it really feels like that. In the end, everything does connect. Everything has its reason as to why it happened. I'll give you one example. They go to a planet. The characters, they all go to this planet. That's sort of what they do. They're a bunch of religious people. They're Catholics on this giant spaceship that can sustain life, and has sustained life for decades, maybe even hundreds of years. And they go to planets, and their goal is to convert whoever's on that planet to their religion, to Christianity or Catholicism. And so they're going to this one planet, and the closer they get, they realize that there's no life signals, even though it's one of the terraformed worlds that's I guess within their system. I can't remember exactly, but they know that people should be there, but there is no life signs. And so when they get there, I'm gonna leave that alone because I don't want to spoil anything. But then they leave that planet, and when they leave, the planet's forgotten about almost completely until near the end. And you almost wonder, like, why did they even go there? Is that necessary? Is it even attached to the plot in any way? But then you find out it is, and so it just really feels, there's so many other things like that happen within this book. So you could blame it on a serious pacing issue within Ship of Fools. Having said that, though, I want more of this type of book, because the things that happen, I've never read anything, and I mean this in the very most positive way. If you could have maybe put those pieces together just a little bit better, this might have been a perfect book. There's things that happen in this book that I've never read before. You want to talk about originality? This book has a lot of originality to it. But then there's not everything within the book is original. But there's some concepts and ideas that I was just like, wow, this is really fascinating. I really enjoyed myself on Ship of Fools. So there's my thoughts on Ship of Fools. I highly recommend it as well, especially if you're looking for space horror. And I read The Vanishing Kind by Lavie Tidhar. This book was really weird, and I mean that in a good way. It was written in a very strange sort of style. It played with tenses a little bit. I don't know if I have the brain power to explain this, but let me try. Okay, first, the plot is the idea that the Nazis had won World War II, and so the Nazis pretty much rule everywhere. The story takes place in London, England, and you follow a detective who's working on a case where a woman was murdered. And that's all I'm going to say, because as usual, I don't want to give too much of the plot away. But the way it's written is very weird, and it's kind of jarring if you don't know what you're getting into, because I was confused for the first couple of chapters. So you start off with the detective talking or thinking about the main suspect, and then it goes into third person without you even really noticing, as you follow the suspect around and to what he did, and because there's always somebody following him. And so you're basically getting the third person account from the detective's research into what his fellow officers who followed him around found out. And so I've never read anything quite like that. That was very interesting, and like I said, very confusing at the beginning. But overall, I really enjoyed The Vanishing Kind, and I want to read more from Lavie Tidhar. It's just going to take some brain power, I think, because reading the synopsis of every other one of his books that I've come across on Amazon or Goodreads or Audible, it seems like there might be something similar going on. A play with words, a play with tenses, a play with just writing in general. And it takes a pretty powerful writer in order to do that. And I think Lavie Tidhar is definitely up to the task. All right, moving on. That's Tales from the Typewriter by Mark Allen Gunnels. Actually, I should mention first that the reason why I don't think I've ever heard of Lavie Tidhar before I talked with or before I did the Jewish Book of Horror panel where I had readings. I'll link that somewhere. And the reason why I mentioned that is because, well, that's what led me to Lavi Titar. It was recommended to me on the show. And also, I read Tales from the Typewriter by Mark Allen Gunnels in preparation to talk to him about that book and another release, When It Rains. And these are the last two books. They're last two because I just finished When It Rains last night. But I read Tales from the Typewriter. I read that one about a month or two ago. Tales from the Typewriter is a short story collection that has a pretty awesome wraparound, meaning it's a story that keeps coming back. Like between the short stories, there's just a little snippet of the continuation of the wraparound. Basically, the wraparound is a man buys an old typewriter, and when he leaves it alone at night, it starts typing out these stories all by itself. The typewriter was owned by this horror writer who I believe committed suicide, and so he's obviously haunting this typewriter, and the stories that come out are pretty dark. I don't think there's any. I have talked about how Mark Allen Gunnels will do two types of stories. He'll do the one that's like horrible and slightly, if not completely, disturbing, and then he'll do the heartwarming story that makes you believe in humanity again. This book doesn't have any of the latter stories. There's no real hope in these stories. These stories are pretty dark. There's no real gore or anything. I would say it's mostly psychological and twisted types of stories, but there's also a real strong feeling of the Twilight Zone within these stories. And not just the Twilight Zone, but I also compared it to Tales from the Crypt or The Vault of Horror, if you remember those old 70s anthology horror movies. That Atticus, I think, was the studio name that put those movies out first. They were a lot of fun to watch anyway, and reading Tales from the Typewriter gave me some serious vibes of those movies, and I highly recommend it, especially if you're a fan of those movies. Alright, and as I said, I just finished When It Rains by Mark Allen Gunnels as well, and this book is a lot of fun as well. It was the basic story for When It Rains is you have a group of characters who all find themselves in the same college campus bookstore, and while they're there, this rain falls, and it's not any normal rain. It's very thick and it's very slimy, and nobody wants to be in it because what if there's something wrong with it? And of course, the news plays a huge role in this, in the way they decide to report what's going on. And so everyone decides that they ain't going back outside. No way, no how. And so they all stay in there, and while they're staying in there away from the rain pours down for about 3 hours. Certain discrepancies within the characters rise to the surface. The biggest one being, what if the people who had been caught out in the rain and ended up in the bookstore, what if they've caught something from the rain? Because it smells like rotting fish, if I remember correctly, and like I said, it's very thick and slimy. So what if people could start getting sick, and what if this sickness is contagious? And so you have a serious divide between the characters. You basically get the two groups who start combating each other. Mark Allen Gunnels really handles the tension in this book masterfully. It goes from just being an innocent sort of story about a strange phenomenon that's happening to something that I got very nervous about reading. I mean, very nervous. I was afraid for some of the characters. So I'm going to leave it at that. I highly recommend anything by Mark Allen Gunnels, but the one thing that I'm finding in reading Mark Allen Gunnels is seeing how he's progressing as a writer, as how he's growing, because he's getting better and better with everything he writes. And so I'm excited to see what's next. This collection, the Tales from the Typewriter and When It Rains, is showing a master at work here. And so, yeah, you got to check it out. All right, so that is it for now. I just wanted to mention that I'm actually rereading The Crown Tower and Magician Apprentice on audiobook, because I've fallen into this weird habit of needing, like, I always listen to audiobooks before going to bed, but I always turn it off before I roll over and go to sleep. So I've come to this conclusion that I like sleeping while somebody's, or falling asleep while somebody's telling me a story. But I can't do that with the book I'm listening to currently, because I won't remember what the hell it was was read last night while I was falling asleep. So what I do is I turn off the audiobook that I was listening to, and I switch it to another book. And lately that's been either Michael J. Sullivan or Raymond E. Feist, because the narrators, their names slip my mind right now, but the narrators they both have kind of soft, easy to listen to voices, and they're just so awesome to get to sleep. So I share this with you. If you have any issues getting to sleep, maybe try a Raymond E. Feist book, especially if you have any nostalgia attached to them, or anything in the Rhyuria Chronicles. Just turn that on for 15 minutes, and if you're anything like me, it'll help you go to sleep if you're ever having trouble getting to sleep, which I'm still having trouble sometimes. So I hope that maybe that little tidbit helps. All right, everyone. So if you listened this far, and you enjoyed what I talked about today, the books I talked about, please leave me some stars deep down there in the darkness, and I will leave you some stars in return. So thank you for watching. Keep being creative. Keep being safe. And if you like this video, there's some videos right there. I like talking about books. I always talk about horror books mostly, but as you saw here, I talk about a lot of fantasy as well. So there's some more videos for you there if you so choose, and I'll talk to you guys in the next bookish video.